Thank you for joining our second panel in the Grazing the Wild series, where we talk about the facts and fiction about grass-fed beef and cow grazing. You can watch the first webinar on our YouTube channel if you missed it, and we're putting a bunch of links in the chat there, so go ahead and check those out, including how to follow and learn more about our panelists. You can also catch all of our webinars on our Take Extinction Off Your Plate webinar page. And remember, our brand new site, grazingfacts.com, can answer many of your questions. And these links are also in the chat. Our format today is going to be conversational. Each of these speakers has made many presentations you can access online. They've written peer-reviewed reports, and they're very active on social media, particularly on Twitter. Today is more of an opportunity to hear from them directly and to map out spaces of overlap, disagreement, and to kind of get a little bit more nuanced on this topic. We're going to take questions at the end, and the questions that we don't get to answer, which will probably be a lot since we have almost 1,000 people on today, we'll continue the conversation on social media and on our later two webinars. We're recording the conversation in case you'd like to share it or rewatch, and you can head over to our Center for Biological Diversity YouTube to find that as well. And again, check the chat. So for a broad overview, people in the United States consume 4 times the global average in beef. In the US, beef production is a leading source of methane emissions, land use, water use, and pollution. And in terms of resources used, cattle grazing is just kind of an inefficient way to grow food. And as beef consumption grows, production has become both increasingly concentrated, with just a few very powerful companies owning the majority of the market share, and it's also become more extensive. Cattle are grazed widely on pastures and forests and public lands, and then most cows are transferred to feedlots to be fattened up before slaughter. They eat corn and soy and other feed crops, which also have a big environmental footprint: land use, emissions, water, fertilizer, and so forth. And that's how most beef is produced in the United States. So just to understand the terms that we're talking about, all cows graze for part of their lives, in the beginning of their lives, or are grass-fed. But some producers are talking about, and they're making big claims about, grass-fed beef, but what they mean is grass-finished beef. So cows who graze on pasture until all the way up until slaughter, and they skip that feedlot step. Instead of being transferred to feedlot systems in factory farms or concentrated animal operations, they are staying out in pasture. So grass-fed or grass-finished beef brings environmental benefits, the claim goes, that if done right, the way that cows graze can actually help sequester carbon or store carbon in the soil and build healthy soils and promote biodiversity. So these are some of the claims that you'll hear. And yet this regenerative theory often comes with trade-offs in increased methane emissions, water pollution, land use, harm to wildlife. And so we want to get a little bit more nuanced about what this looks like and what good solutions might be. There's also regional limitations, temporary life limitations, and a lot of these models work best, of course, with significantly reduced herd size, which in itself is going to be a benefit, and relates to reduced consumption as well. So proponents of grass-fed beef are quick to attribute the impact of cattle on the feedlot system, but feedlots only produce 11% of beef's greenhouse gas emissions, and they help decrease land use for grazing. It's not an ideal system, of course. It comes with all kinds of things, from cruelty to additional pollution and so forth. So there's a lot of myths and misunderstanding between these models and in terms of the impact that cows have and the roles that they have to play in climate change and biodiversity solutions. So the question really becomes, what economic, agricultural, and climate policies make the most sense for beef production? What policies take us in the right direction? What policies take us in the wrong direction? And we're going to dive into these topics and more with our expert panel today, but let me introduce our experts first. Dr. Jonathan Foley is a world-renowned environmental scientist, sustainability expert, author, science communicator, and public speaker. And he has published more than 130 peer-reviewed scientific articles, Science, Nature, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. He's also the executive director of Project Drawdown, of course. And he holds a PhD in atmospheric sciences from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Welcome. And next we have Dr. Matthew Hayek, who is an assistant professor of environmental sciences at NYU, New York University. He has presented and written numerous influential peer-reviewed papers as well on this topic, and he holds a PhD from Harvard, Harvard's John A. Paulson School of Engineering and Applied Science, in addition to a degree in physics from Wesleyan. And then finally, we have Dr. Sylvia Secchi. She is trained as a national resource economist, geographer, and transdisciplinary scholar. Sorry, that was hard for me to say. She is a professor at the University of Iowa in the Department of Geographical and Sustainability Sciences and Public Policy Center. A thoroughly published scholar herself in food, agriculture, and policy issues, she holds a PhD in economics. So we have many different backgrounds and expertise here to bring to this conversation. So welcome to everyone. And I want to start with Jonathan first. Given your expertise in climate and environmental science, to start us off, can you just sort of kick us off with a broad overview of what's going on with emissions? What's your broad overview where you see opportunities, obstacles, false solutions, that kind of thing in terms of cows?
Yeah, well, thank you, Jennifer. And thank you all to folks participating and to other panelists. So a lot of people I really admire here today, which is really great. And what a great conversation to have, especially in light of the new IPCC report that came out earlier this week. Yeah, so here we are talking about dairy and beef production, essentially, cows, cattle, the whole thing. And gosh, they really do have a pretty significant impact on greenhouse gas emissions. One aspect of how they affect the environment. Of course, there's other things like land use and biodiversity. There's water and watersheds, the emergence of zoonotic disease, all sorts of other issues here, which others can speak about probably a lot better than I can. But when it comes to the kind of greenhouse gases, basically we have to worry about three major areas of emissions that are related to beef and dairy operations. First is probably the biggest in a lot of ways is deforestation, interestingly, not in the United States so much, but in other parts of the world where large areas of forest are still being cleared for new agricultural land, particularly in the Amazon, where forests are being cleared primarily for cattle grazing itself, which is kind of insane to do in the middle of the Amazon. And second is to clear more land for animal feed, in this case, soybeans. Although to be fair, a lot of those soybeans are being fed to pigs in Asia, not so much cattle. But soybeans, generally speaking, are part of animal feed all over the world. So animal agriculture is pretty big in terms of deforestation. Deforestation, burns down trees, essentially, releasing vast amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere. And so animal agriculture and beef are a contributor to deforestation. So we got to make sure we pay attention to that part. The second part is the one everybody loves to talk about, is methane coming from these animals. It's really fun to talk about cow farts and cow burps and stuff and all that. By the way, cows burp most of their methane, not fart it. So if you remember anything from what I said, it's usually the fact that cows burp methane more than they fart. Everybody seems to giggle at that. But of course, as we all remember, they have these four-chambered stomachs where they can digest things like grasses and forbs and stuff that we can't. And that's an anaerobic process, so it releases methane through their front end into the atmosphere. And methane's a really powerful greenhouse gas, and it has a particular quality of heating the atmosphere really hard, but very fast. Methane warms the atmosphere for about 10, 20, 30 years or so, and then it kind of fades away. It's the James Dean of kind of climate gases. It lives fast, warms fast, dies young, whatever. So it's different than carbon dioxide, which warms more gradually and more persistently into the future. So we have to think about methane a little differently. The third area that beef and dairy operations kind of contribute to climate change, as Jennifer mentioned, is really more around the feedlots. It's how we create the feed, particularly corn and soybeans, for beef, and the fact that those are also using land, have other emissions, particularly nitrous oxide, another greenhouse gas that we don't talk about enough, N2O, which is emitted on farm fields where we overuse fertilizer and manure. And some of the nitrogen in that stuff combines with air and water in the soil and emits N2O into the atmosphere. Particularly the American Midwest, where I live, and I'm sure a lot of folks here are on the call too, where we have the corn and soybean belt. That's a huge emission source for nitrous oxide, and a lot of that stuff is being used as animal feed or ethanol. So those are the kind of big sources of greenhouse gases from the food system. Beef component is deforestation for beef and the animal feed that we might use, methane from cattle themselves, and nitrous oxide from the fertilizers that were used to grow the animal feed that maybe isn't a feedlot. So those are the kind of the variables. And if you add it all together, there are different estimates, of course, a lot of different studies out there. Matthew's done some himself, he can talk about, others have too. But the round numbers over the literature seem to be in the order of, 14, 15% are numbers I see thrown around of all global greenhouse gas emissions. If we put them on a common currency called a GWP 100, which is if we average them over 100 years. I don't think we should be doing that, by the way. I think it should be 20 years. That's an argument, in which case that number would be even larger. But let's call it 100, and I'd say it's around 14, call it 15% of all greenhouse gas emissions come from basically beef and dairy operations, whether grass or feedlot and combined. To put that in perspective, the entire United States today is about 12% of global emissions. Everything we do in the United States is smaller than that. If beef and dairy were a country, it'd be the second largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world after China. So that's pretty significant. And well, it's huge. And so it's really important to see what we can do about that. And I'm sure others will speak to this too. The question is grass finished beef truly better? Well, it might be in some respects, but there are going to be trade-offs I'm sure we'll talk about. More land will be needed. That's going to be a problem. Is the methane really accounted for properly? Probably not. Is the soil carbon built up in the soil really as vast as some people are saying it might be? Probably not, would be my guess, and what a lot of the literature seems to point out. And then how long can you keep doing it? Do the soils kind of effectively saturate, not hold more carbon after a little while, maybe a decade or two? Probably. And is it truly permanent? Or are those soils potentially lost in the future when farming practices change again? And most of all, is this even verifiable? Can we measure it? Can we count on it? How do we audit it? All these kinds of questions come up. And unfortunately, while there might be some good potential here to make some incremental improvements, and that's good, are we kind of losing sight of that compared to what might be a lot of hyperbole by a few loud voices kind of claiming vast amounts of carbon storage, which may not be physically realistic or justified by the science? So there's a lot of open questions here, and I'm looking forward to seeing how we can dive into this.
Thank you so much. That's a great overview. And I appreciate the numbers and your ability to kind of communicate that in a way that we can understand, because it's going to be kind of nuanced and hard for people to grasp. And I'm wondering, Matthew, if you can tell us about your research a little bit in your overview, if you align with Dr. Foley. And, we were just talking about before your 2018 paper, maybe you could tell us about land use. What would grass-fed beef mean for land use?
Sure. Thanks so much, Jennifer. And thanks as well for the 250 people in attendance. This is amazing. All of you get credit for this event, but especially thanks to, Jennifer and Stephanie and the folks at Center for Biological Diversity. Have been doing such a fantastic job lately of pulling together such diverse perspectives and asking questions that a lot of folks have been struggling to ask. So really incredible to be here, both with Jonathan and Sylvia today. Kind of a meeting of the Twitter minds of sort. Really, really great to be here. John's perspective was fantastic. I mean, again, this is all very timely in light of the recent IPCC report, which is typically, this is the 6th report that's come out, but it feels like it's going to be the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, because they're dividing this major report into multiple working groups. And each group concerns a new different vast area of climate change. The first report was just on the physical scientific basis. Now we're on to how to mitigate this problem. And Jonathan pointed out 3 major greenhouse gases: CO2, predominantly from deforestation; methane, predominantly from belches and poop; and nitrous oxide, predominantly from poop and fertilizer. And while there are many out there saying that methane has this, well, let me dial back a little bit. The report basically says there is no way of hitting our climate targets if we don't address all 3 of these greenhouse gases, reduce their emissions, all 3 of them, drastically within the next several years. So I just want to be really clear about that. And the reason I want to be clear about that is because there are folks out there taking what John said about methane, which is that it burns hot and it burns fast. And they just kind of focus on the fast part, and they go, well, and they say a true statement here, which is that because it burns so fast, we don't have to decrease our emissions down to zero in order to stop global warming. That is actually true. We don't need to reduce our anthropogenic methane emissions all the way down to zero in order to flatten global warming. The problem is with that is that we are so addicted to fossil fuels, and we have been. We've had such a hard time getting off of them that we need to do more than flatline our methane emissions and the warming from methane. We actually need to drastically decrease methane emissions. Getting to zero isn't good enough. With methane, we have to go negative, more or less. And again, there are lots of ways to do that. Folks have been exploring technological methods from, of course, capturing more methane at the source of oil drilling, from better technology managing our landfills, where methane comes out as a result of this oxygenless breakdown, this anaerobic breakdown. And also by, through better technology with feeding cattle better feed and, capping their methane in the giant manure lagoons that they poop into in these consolidated farms. And that's all well and good. Sure, we should explore that. We should research it. I think it's a little premature, however, to incentivize it already when it doesn't seem to have the ability to produce that much. And crucially, according to the science, the best ways that we know to reduce this agricultural methane is to eat less meat and waste way less of it. So that's really a bottom line that I want to get to here. I think we can talk a lot about policies of other kind of supply side methods to reduce its emission. But the last point that I want to say is that John is totally right that we need to worry about trade-offs from incentivizing one good behavior that could in turn in a complicated way lead to other potentially negative behaviors. This happens in environmental science all the time, and we're in this discipline where we need to look not only at how things happen on one farm, but how that farm is in turn connected to the atmosphere, the soils, our aquatic ecosystems, every life support system on Earth. This is really what environmental systems science is all about. And Sylvia certainly is no stranger to this either, with her background in economics, because economics can all about be complicated feedback loops and trade-offs associated with like how we enrich our lives, right? So again, that's why I'm very excited to be a part of this conversation today. Hopefully we can drill down a little bit more into these trade-offs. But suffice to say, whenever you see a silver bullet out there, always question it, because that silver bullet could turn into a smoking gun associated with all of tradebacks or perverse feedback effects all throughout this complicated Earth life support and human system that we've gotten ourselves embroiled into. So
thank you, Matt.
That.
And I want to revisit in a minute the question of land use and your paper, and also maybe carbon credits and these kinds of things, maybe even talk about the CRP. But Sylvia, I want to transition over to you. What Matthew was just mentioning with the importance of economics. You've been a vocal critic of a lot of industry greenwashing in Iowa, for example. I encourage everyone to check out Dr. Secchi on Twitter. I put her link in there, Professor Secchi, for some incredibly informative posts and her podcast link about ethanol and corn overproduction, water pollution from animal agriculture and so forth, but also the way that politics are playing out on both sides of this, both sides of the aisle, in ways that aren't necessarily good for the environment. So my question is, can you talk a little bit about the idea you stated previously that there's no climate solution, no regenerative agriculture solution until the US addresses the policy of systemic agricultural overproduction? And you talked to us about subsidies and overproduction, crop insurance, for example, that encourages pollution, so that we get a frame on scalability of the solutions in your work.
Yes, and let me reiterate what Matthew said before. Thank you so much for hosting this. And these are really, you talked about our podcast with my colleagues here at the University of Iowa. I think these are really, really important issues, and we don't have enough representation of these issues. The industry has been flooding the zone, if you will, with a lot of we can call it greenwashing. My 15-year-old called it propaganda. Living in Iowa, my friend Chris Jones calls some of these people oligarchs from CAFOs or ethanolians. So I think it's really important that people understand, as you were saying, Jennifer, and as Matthew was saying, this is not like a free market. And this is a system that is driven by policy. In fact, I would say this has always been driven by policy from white settlement on, right? The way the land was allotted to white people and taken away from Native Americans in North America was a policy. It was a policy choice. And the way we have chosen, for example, to allow grazing Bureau of Land Management land, that's a policy, right? And to a large extent, what we're seeing now is the result of the acceleration of these policies, in which all we can really do is produce more and more of the same. We are very, very good at these very simple systems, right? We have the land grant university systems, we have subsidized research and development, we have whole ag biosystem departments. And what they do is they call it optimize. I would say they're externalizing costs, right? So what we have, because of the subsidies and the lack of accounting for the social costs of these practices, we have a wide gap between what we pay at the store, which causes that level of consumption of meat in particular, and ethanol, but that's related to the mandate too, versus what it costs to the planet, right? As Jonathan was illustrating at the beginning. We have this huge gap, and this is what the industry is afraid of addressing. So the issue here is that upstream of the production of cattle, there is subsidies via the crop insurance program. And the crop insurance program focuses on grains, particularly corn, and oilseeds like soybeans, so on the feedstocks for these animals. So they're cheaper, right? And so that decreases the inputs and increases the capacity of the industry to produce. And then at the level of these of livestock production, we don't account for environmental costs. And so the beef is cheaper. I live in Iowa, and we don't have as much beef as other places, but it's amazing. Anytime you take your car out of town, there's cows in the creek. That's pollution, right? And there's no accountability for that. There's erosion on the creek banks. So that is not accounted for in the cost of the meat. So many of my colleagues in economics say, oh, this is a much more efficient system. Well, it's efficient because we don't account for so many portions of it. And I would say, going forward, some of the things that Matthew was talking about really worry me a lot, because I think that industry has realized that there's money to be made from climate change mitigation in ways that don't fundamentally challenge these crucial, critical imbalances. And so we're seeing now money for biodigesters. And in Iowa, for example, we have dairies that are already saying, yes, we're going to install biodigesters, and we're also going to expand. And so you have that system level accounting that needs to happen, because if you are expanding and producing more, then you have to consider all those upstream emissions that Jonathan was talking about in terms of the crops that are used to produce this. And so we're going to have net zero beef on subsidized. And what we're seeing in Iowa is deregulation. Well, these people are doing good things for the climate, so we should not regulate the how they dispose of the digestate. Well, the digestate hasn't lost any nitrogen, and so we're still a pollutant. So I am concerned that going forward, there's not going to be that system level analysis of some of the policies that rely on public money. And this is gonna, it's very important what Jonathan said at the beginning in terms of deforestation, because this spills over, it leaks into world supply chains and, via international markets. It's not just our bad policies, right? It's not just us Americans destroying our environment. This has planetary implications and environmental justice implications outside the United States.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. Yeah, I think we can have a whole episode just on biodigesters, right? Oh my goodness. And the way that they can continue business as usual, and this creative accounting, not only with emissions, but with the funding that goes on, and how much is having an impact on and other environmental metrics. So let's go back to carbon credits then. I want to ask Jonathan a question. There's been a variety of solutions proposed. We look at the model that Sylvia's talking about, and we think, wow, this regenerative offers all of these other solutions out of this. Let's talk about the pros and cons of that. What do you think about paying farmers to sequester carbon? Is that the solution? Does it include discussion of how much they're already emitting? The carbon benefits of big claims of regenerative practices, are they meaningful only if they outweigh the emissions cost of production already? Are they doing that? I guess you had a quote once that I read. You can build all the carbon sinks you want, but if you still have to turn off the sources of pollution. What do you think about carbon credit?
Well, the joke about, have you ever met a one-handed scientist? I'm going to try to be balanced here, saying on one hand, it's good that farmers are encouraged to put more carbon back on the landscape. That would be a good thing, whether it's in soils or in, restored vegetation, buffer strips, more, silvopasture. There are a lot of good things that I would like to see incentivized, whether it's in croplands or pastures, that could restore the health of the system somewhat. I think, overall, that is a good thing. But when you are ignoring the elephant in the room, which in this case is a cow, I guess, of, hey, these emissions are huge. And maybe the first order way to address them isn't to tweak the system, it's to ask the larger economic question of like, are we just consuming too damn much of this stuff? Are we subsidizing too much of this stuff? And are we wasting too much of this stuff? I mean, to first order, and Matthew said this, we've also, Sylvia said this as well, I think in her great presentation, the economics of this are encouraging overuse and overwaste and pretending it's efficient because we're not paying for the real cost to the environment or to human health or to biodiversity or anything else when we buy our dairy products and our beef. So we've got to think about that. The first thing, no question is we're going to need less consumption of beef, period. There's just no other mathematical way to talk about this. Second, we need to waste a lot less of it. When 40% of the food on this planet is, including beef and dairy, is wasted, that's criminal. I mean, that's what a waste of resources and opportunity and food security and everything else. Funny thing about food waste, when you talk about food waste, most people think about like the produce aisle of the supermarket, think about lettuce or something. I'm like, I look at the beef counter and think, wow, it took 30, calories of corn to grow this 1 calorie of beef here in America. So it's like a 30-to-1 multiplier on food waste. I don't want to waste that. That's a huge opportunity. If we could focus our efforts on food waste on beef and dairy products, that would be really important. Also for food safety. So that's another big lever. And then third, yes, this regenerative stuff, absent the nonsense claims that some groups are making around this, and getting to the science that would probably say it's marginally better, but it's still emitting greenhouse gases, is not a net carbon sink. I'm not convinced any regenerative systems can be a big, long-term permanent sink of carbon. I've not seen any real clear evidence of that yet, except some cherry-picked numbers, not systematically. So it's less beef, less waste, and yeah, farm it better, of course. But that should be the last line of, or, let's proceed in parallel with all three. So I'm sorry that's a kind of a muddled answer, but I think that's the right answer. Is like it's going to be demand reductions massively, food waste, absolutely. And then how we grow beef in general and dairy. Yeah, some of the regenerative stuff could be helpful. But if that's the only thing we're doing, it's a treadmill. It's not really solving the bigger problems. And it could even be a false promise of more carbon being absorbed than could ever physically happen. And that's where we get distracted. And maybe we don't put enough effort onto what we should be doing, which is kind of looking at the overall consumption economic system. And sometimes I worry that's what that's designed to do, is to distract us from actually looking at demand and waste and saying, I've got a techno fix. Not everybody's doing that, but some people might be, and that's worrisome to me.
Yeah, thank you. I want to open that up to Matthew and Sylvia too, if you agree, if you have anything to add there as well. And it sounds reasonable enough, but why don't we talk about demand as much? And the title Culture Wars of this webinar I added because even the idea of eating less it creates a panic. And we've had things like claims that Biden's going to ban beef, and in Colorado there was this outrage over a meat out day, and just the idea that where people are coming for their beef, hands off my beef. And where is this coming from? I wonder if you're seeing that reflected in policy resistance to, which would seem on the face of it, pretty reasonable climate policy suggestions from Dr. Foley there.
Well, I can say that right here from the heart of the heartland. The main issue is you don't want to change the narrative, right? In terms of like farmers really want, as our podcast title, we all want clean water. We don't want to do anything about it, but we want clean water. We all want a stable climate. We don't want to do anything about it, right? And so I think that there are various issues at play here that have all to do with the political economy of agriculture, not just in the United States, by the way. I'm from Italy, and the common agricultural policy is another pit of subsidies, has a long history of it. So I think that what we see is a real reluctance to do transformative changes. And Jonathan said, yes, you can have regenerative solutions, but they have to be part of a larger transformative portfolio that absolutely includes eating less meat and also providing people affordable protein that they can eat, right? So there is a huge, and we haven't touched on this, and I think it's very important, there is a huge issue related to access to healthy food in America, which is related to our income inequalities. Think about the whole food stamp program, the WIC program, right? And so I think in this transition, for the transition to be just, we have to be considerate of the people who eat burgers at McDonald's because they're fast and they fill them up, right? And so this is really transformative because you're not just changing what farmers grow, but you're also changing some of the big commercial retailers of food in the United States. But all these things have to happen. You can't just have regenerative beef. I'm sure Matthew has the numbers, would require massive amounts of land, right? We can't do that. And so what we need to do is we need to reduce and do better and find alternatives in terms of affordable, healthy food that people can have access to. And I think, for example, a place to start is school lunches. The school lunches in America are terrible. They are an indirect subsidy to the industry, right? Because you have to eat so much animal protein, and it's not good animal protein in these places. So I think there's leverage points if we are serious about changing this system.
I think there's a lot to cover here, and I agree with my colleagues. I think that I just kind of want to complicate the story a little bit of saying that we need to change our demand, and we don't like having our choices kind of trounced upon. And and I agree with this, right? Like as Americans, to a large extent, as like more or less affluent people in the developed global north, we don't like regulation or anything that is perceived as an impingement on our freedoms. But something that the most recent IPCC report chapter makes clear is that just changing the supply is going to be really difficult and perhaps insufficient to crank down all of the greenhouse gases, the CO2, the methane, and the nitrous oxide that we need to get where we want to go. And we do need to look at demand side levers. And a story that's beginning to emerge from the social science and behavioral sciences literature is that the environment in which we make choices is critical. So, you know, there's a large extent to which school children don't even really make choices. They might choose between the regular and chocolate milk, you know, 2% in chocolate milk. They might choose to pick up the Jello or not. But for the most part, their choice environment is largely dictated to them. And that doesn't change when we're adults, right? The composition of fast food restaurants in everywhere from strip malls to the Bronx, the cantinas at our various workplaces as we're all getting back to them. These are all crucial environments for making choices or lack thereof on what we are demanding, and not just us, our workplaces, and the institutions that we're all a part of, including the government. So I think there's a lot that can be done on demand that is not just like nanny state, get your hands off my burger, kind of doesn't necessarily inspire those. There's lots of ways that we can in a smart way, pull the rug out from this overconsumption in a ways that can address the overproduction, including like the billions of, I'm exaggerating here, but we have like billions of tons of meat and cheese in like caves in the Ozarks, right? There's a massive amount of overproduction and consumption because of these subsidies, because the government is a reliable purchaser of all of this overproduction. And right, there's stuff that a lot of affluent countries can do in terms of addressing this overconsumption and production.
Thank you. I'm glad you mentioned it that way, because a lot of people point to other countries, and I think it's important to talk about how the global north problems and global north solutions are going to be different than other places because of the wealth of information that shows the impact that our overconsumption is having. So let's focus right here and on many of the justice issues that Sylvia mentioned as well. Matthew, I want to get the answer from you. Could we switch to an all grass-fed system given our 4 times the global overconsumption rate?
No, we can't eat all the beef we want and switch to entirely grass finished. How much we reduce depends on where we want to grow that grass. So we can grow that grass much more abundantly in Iowa or in upstate New York than we can in the arid West, in like sagebrush country. And depending on where we want to grow that grass, whether we want to use croplands to do it or only so-called marginal lands, we would have to reduce our consumption by anywhere between 39% and 73%. So eating 4 times less than we are currently. And then we could potentially approach, you know, what one might call a sustainable level of beef consumption. Of course, that still assumes that there's all this grazing in creek beds and on arage lands and on BLM lands that Sylvia and Jennifer, your organization, has done a really crucial job in showing like, well, it's not exactly, you know, paradisic either. So, you know, there are larger conversations about, you know, what sustainable grazing actually consists of that I think are incredibly complicated and nuanced. But, you know, even in order to approach that, we need to think about cutting our consumption at least in half, if not by 3/4.
Thank you. And then Sylvia, I want to ask you, could the beef industry exist? I know a lot of people probably in the comments thinking, what's grass? And it has all these benefits. And, you know, they've got a lot of questions to ask, and I'm going to get to those in a second. Could the beef industry exist without subsidies?
Well, let's also not forget that the beef industry is highly concentrated. It's an oligopoly, right? So the distortion of prices here it's in every element of the supply chain. It happens at the farm level because of the whether we're talking about leasing grazelands, public grazelands, or whether we're talking about finishing and the cost of that feed, all the way up to the slaughterhouse, where we have issues related to labor. Right, we've seen during COVID that these slaughterhouse farmers are some of the people who got hit the hardest because of COVID. So I think that without the subsidies and the subsidies writ large, Jennifer, because the technology we have created is a subsidy too, right? We have created a system in which we have this kind of you know, feedlots, we have this kind of waste systems, waste disposal systems. I think it would look very different. It would look very much smaller. I think American agriculture would look very different if we didn't have all these subsidies that essentially drive the overproduction of the feed, right? And it's almost like, oh, if there are economists here, they're going to be very mad at me, but the production of corn and soybeans in America is now an independent variable. We have that production, we need to dispose of it. It has nothing to do with market forces. And so downstream of that comes the ethanol and comes the CAFOs and comes the corn finished beef. So if we hit that, like if we got rid of that, the system would look very, very different. And one of the things that's really interesting is we don't even have the capacity to model these changes very well because, you know, nobody really even wants to talk about them because they would be really transformative. Thank
you. And, you know, I think this just sort of adds to what Matthew's point is. I think it's something like $20 million worth of cheese stored that the government buys back. And this is true with corn. And this is why we have the ethanol industry. And people are thinking about it differently. You know, they think, well, we have all these cows, and so we need all this corn. But it's really that we have all this corn, and so we need all these cows. And this is not a healthy system. And so I imagine that there are people listening who are thinking, but I'm talking about small regenerative family farms, not this larger model of consolidated mega power and so forth. But the problem is the system that you're talking about, right? And, you know, I encourage people to look into how much legumes, fruits and vegetables are subsidized, because it's not what we're talking about. So my question then, a roundabout way for Jonathan, is what policy solutions, given what you mentioned about reducing consumption and talking about demand and reducing food waste, are there any policy solutions out there right now that you think have some legs or that we should focus more attention on, or that you'd encourage people to not fall for if they're false?
Yeah, well, Sylvia explains this far better than I can as an economist and knows much more about this. But clearly, the ethanol subsidy we have, I mean, we're propping up a corn cartel essentially across America that is vastly larger than it should be. If you ask, it's a really interesting question. One of my former graduate students, Emily Cassidy, did a really wonderful master's thesis at the University of Minnesota years ago, where she analyzed the world's crop production, but not in tons per hectare or bushels per acre, but in terms of how many meals ultimately were delivered to people from that acre of land through its current agricultural use. And when you look at the upper Midwest, where Sylvia and I both live, it's kind of depressing because we grow so much stuff and yet it feeds so few people, because most of it's diverted into gas tanks and into the bellies of animals. And then we eat the animals. So interestingly, like Bangladesh feeds more people per acre than Iowa can. Not because the corn isn't a bad plant, it isn't, it's a magnificent crop. But as a system, economic, political, and subsidized system, we're misusing it so badly. Most of the corn we grow in this country, you can drive from Pennsylvania to Colorado and see nothing but corn and soybeans. Most of it's used for non-food purposes. Well, feed indirectly becomes food, 30-to-1. Or, you know, high fructose corn syrup, but mostly it's used for ethanol and things like that. That's crazy. And we're subsidizing that. And we haven't even mentioned some of the big externalities, not just climate change and watershed impairment and human health, nitrate issues in groundwater across the upper Midwest, blue baby syndrome, oh my God. But also, you know, the death of the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, which is entirely produced by this corn and soybean belt. The fertilizer runoff from the upper Mississippi is literally killing part of our coastal oceans. That's insane. And we're subsidizing that to happen. We want that to happen. We're paying for that to happen. We need to think really harder about this and say, if we're going to subsidize agriculture, which I think we're going to have to, should we do it with the greatest public benefit to health, to equity, to justice, to the environment, to long-term well-being of our country? We sure as hell aren't doing that now. So it's kind of easy for me to wave my arms and say we should just get rid of the subsidies and all that. But that's largely a political question, not just an economic one. There's a lot of power brokers in the system that are very powerful and keep it the way it is. But we as consumers can do our little policy changes too about what we eat and what we do, where we work, where schools are, and, you know, nudge those things along through putting our monies where, you know, where our mouths are in terms of dietary changes and food waste and all these things too. So Washington's probably the last thing that's going to change. It's probably going to be starting somewhere else first. But anyway, it's a system that needs change desperately. It may be well intended, but it's just kind of gone off the rails into something that's not really healthy for all of us.
Thanks for that, John. I agree wholeheartedly that like the renewable fuel standard has been really decimating a lot of the American Midwest and a lot of the natural beauty there, and as Sylvia very well knows. And at the same time, subsidies are nearly impossible to remove once you've already implemented, and there's somebody who becomes more powerful by benefiting off of them. And the reason I bring that up is not to say, don't worry about the subsidies, let's move on. Of course, we need to address these things. And in my way, in John's way, in Sylvia's way, we all work on understanding what the ripple effects of these systems are. There was just a major study that came out of, I think, University of Wisconsin, where John got his PhD, and Minnesota, where he was faculty for a while, showing the implications of the renewable fuel standard, not only because of all the fossil fuels they use, but the land clearing and tilling and carbon emissions that they led to, has amounted to all of this corn having a higher carbon footprint than the gasoline that it was supposed to displace. So we can spend years focusing on these systematic problems, but the renewable fuel standard is still in place. And there's this larger policy problem of like, when you have a policy maker, there's this political economy, right? You have a policy maker wanting to know what he can do or she can do to make their constituents happy. And on one hand, there's this really complicated problem and all of this attendant, and we have to reach down and dig up the roots of, bad policy for the past 50 years. Or here's the shiny new toy that's kind of caused bad burps to go away. It's always going to be the shiny new toy, right? So there's very low attention spans. And generally in our country's political history, we've needed to change the conversation to get the policy to change. And so what I try to do is not in a complete way, but look at, and the others here have been very successful at this as well, is look at analogies between our energy systems and our food systems, the fossil fuels and the agriculture. There are lots of ways these break apart, right? Methane that comes from belches is fundamentally different than CO2 that comes from fossil fuels. But I think clean coal is informative. And there was this movement, right, to get the industry movement to get clean coal branded as a lower carbon and lower impact fuel. And while the coal barons tried pushing this, there was a massive resistance against it. And that resistance did not come from detailed economic and environmental analysis. There were folks saying, there were scientific papers showing, yeah, this doesn't quite do what we want it to do. But really what I saw in the mid 2000s were like ad campaigns on the DC Metro that had a dead canary on them, saying there's no such thing as clean coal. And so what was able to happen, in addition to coal getting displaced just because natural gas got cheaper, and that's a whole other story, but we were able to kind of remove the coal baron's social license because we came up with a compelling narrative that distilled all of this complexity into a greater vision of what futures we do and don't want for ourselves, and communicate that really clearly with the full drive of advocates and activists. And the upside down, dead canary and there's no such thing as clean coal. I think we need this rising awareness in terms of the subsidies, the political and industrial control over some of the biggest drivers of greenhouse gas emissions in the agricultural systems. Our agricultural conversations just are not where our energy systems are at. And there's this concept of the Overton window. There's what we debate on both sides versus the Overton window. That's where we're having the debate in the first place. And I think we need to shift the Overton window. Outside of the sciences, a big role of civil society has been and needs to be shifting the conversation to kind of relegate what isn't acceptable behavior anymore, especially from these large, industrial agricultural operators and the increasing corporate consolidation of our first world livestock production.
I cannot agree more with what Matthew just said. I think that, one of the things we face is in Iowa, less than 3% of the people are farmers. They are all white people and they are richer than the average Iowa. But the narrative here is still that those are the real Iowan. I get told all the time, by the way, what do you know? You're not a farmer. And people who just grow corn and beans are like, well, don't get a farmer mad at you. What are you going to eat? I gotta say, I'm probably in one of the few households in Iowa that nixtamalates their own corn and makes corn tortillas from scratch. But if they don't give me their corn and beans, I'm gonna be just fine, right? So I think in terms of changing the narrative, I think we need to think about issues of power and agency in how really this is not working. We're depopulating rural areas. We are spending all this public money for which there is no accountability. And so trying to engage the public at large, the 97% of Iowans who are not farmers. And even with all, in Iowa, less than 20% of the economy is related to farming, the upstream, downstream, the ethanol, everything. So, there is 1 out of 5 Iowans that has a link to agriculture. We need to engage the other 4 who use the water for recreation, as Jonathan was saying, who are, who don't want to get blue baby syndrome, who are maybe worried that the nitrate standards don't reflect the latest science, right? And so all these are the issues that we need to bring to the fore, I think.
Thank you so much. We only have a few minutes and like 100 questions, so we're not going to get to them. I'm sorry to everyone, but we will continue on social media. All of us are very active on Twitter, by the way. But you can also email me, and I'm going to tell you more about that in a second. But one of the questions I thought was interesting is, Sylvia, you mentioned access to food and access to healthy, sustainable food and justice issues. And our next webinar on this topic is going to be more about the history of cows and colonization and justice issues, and histories and legacies and land access and all these kinds of things. But the question is, do you folks see a potential future for regional food systems? Is this possible in diverse climates and growing areas in the US? I think this is a really interesting question, given climate impacts regionally, given the regional benefits where cows are more appropriate in some areas than other, and given efficiency issues. This is a complicated topic where we're talking about feed crops and CAFOs and factory farms and smaller grazing. Is this possible? Is a regional food system possible? Is that the solution we should look to? Any thoughts?
Yeah, Christian Peters out of Tufts have actually done some really fantastic modeling in the Northeast, basically showing that there is a potential to expand regional food systems. It would just, if folks wanted to eat local, just like similarly if they wanted to eat only grass-fed beef, a fair amount of meat reduction would need to take place. And I saw multiple comments in the chats that was like, what should I eat? I try to purchase from local farmers. I try not to eat too much industrial food. And I think that's all well and good. If you're eating from local farms, that's you're more locavore than the average bear. But there's a larger consideration, which I think would have to do with do unto others, the golden rule. What if everyone ate like I did? And I think eating locally is fantastic, but local food systems probably could not maintain, a porterhouse steak every week and multiple servings of chicken and, pork barbecues every other weekend, right? So there is not necessarily a meat-free future, but a drastically less meat consumption system in which a lot of our food is produced closer to home, if that's something you care about, right? But then there's a whole host of issues that and something that we haven't actually mentioned in this conversation yet is that food transportation only accounts for, for up to 11% of our food system emissions. So really, if you want to reduce your greenhouse gas footprint, eating less meat certainly should be on the table. If, however, there's a farmer at your farmer's market that you really like, if you like being able to know your farmer personally, there's a whole host of issues to kind of keep your money in the state. But it's not the kind of be all end all of environmentalism. because we all exist in systems. Most of our food production is globalized now at this point, and that doesn't even necessarily have a huge carbon footprint. So yeah, I mean, you yourself can do all sorts of things that make things more sustainable, but we're really kind of, you know, in John's 2011 paper, Solutions for a Cultivated Planet, try convincing 8 billion, 10 billion other people to do that thing, right? We need to think about what's actually going to begin to work at scale, because that is really the challenge of this problem, is how land is being used across vast continents.
Thank you so much. Just want to thank Matthew Hayek and Jonathan Foley and Sylvia Secchi for joining us. And we are going to continue these conversations in our next webinar series, which will be April 28th. And I put the links in the chat. And I spoke really fast before last time, so I'm going to give everyone a few more minutes to look at the chat and copy that if you need to, because there's a lot of great links in there. Any last comments from my great panelists, resources you'd like people to check out, or upcoming articles or websites or anything like that?
Well, stay tuned for what happens with the Farm Bill discussions, because I think that there is a lever there, changing the crop insurance system to facilitate the existence of diversified farmers would be a really good place to start to move in the direction that Matthew was talking about.
Project Drawdown.
Yeah,
Fantastic set of solutions across the food and energy systems.
Read everything Matthew, Sylvia, and Jennifer write. You'd be better off for it. I certainly do. Read everything.
One of the questions we got was some books you could recommend as well. So if there's any off the top of your head, but if not, you maybe can post some on Twitter for people as well. If people are still reading books, I'm delighted to hear that. So that's great. But there's some great websites that you're all on as well. So thank you very much for your insights. I hope people will continue the conversation, and yeah, do your best for the planet. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.